So we're going to look at a method of adding IPs into the vertical grading editor and snapping onto the design constraint using something called IP reference, which is found in the VGE ribbon. Now, we haven't shown you this tool yet, so we're going to show you how it operates just generally and then show you how we can use the tool to work alongside the constraint. So I'm going to just double click my mouse wheel in the VGE screen to make it zoom extents. Then I'm going to remove the design entirely. So I'm going to click on delete all IPs. I'm going to say yes. Now, if you are using multiple screens, you may notice at some point in the drawing environment that the contours have increased quite significantly in the drawing environment, and this is because the left edge of bitumen is now following this particular profile string. So any adjustments we make, we're making significant design changes to the entire model. So we'll come back and look at this in a second, but for the time being, we're going to ignore what's happening with that particular model. Just going to make the vertical grading editor full screen. Currently, when we've looked at creating IPs, they've been based on clicking in the vertical grading editor or using the grid editor and selecting from a location in the drawing. There are two buttons found next to the Add IP button on the design panel. They'll both do pretty much the same thing when it comes to adding IPs, but they operate slightly differently. So we're going to choose the top of the two buttons and then left click somewhere around chainage 70. It really doesn't matter where. Now, as soon as you do that, you'll notice that when you've left-clicked, an IP is created on top of the sampled surface at the nearest sample line. And you'll find that wherever you left-click, that the software will always snap to the nearest sample line, place an IP onto the sampled surface. If you choose the bottom of the two, and then try the same thing, so this time I'm going to be around chainage 36, wherever I left click, the software will apply an IP at exactly that point on the surface. So if you find that you need some detail of IPs around a surface of some sort and you're not getting that detail, then you can use this tool to manually add IPs onto the sampled surface. The reason why they're getting placed onto the sampled surface is because our IP reference is currently set to 1 ns. So ns represents whatever the sampled surface is, and that happens to be the pasted surface. What we're going to do is to remove these points that we've just added in by again clicking on delete all IPs and saying yes, we want to remove them. We can use the same tool to add IPs onto a constraint. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in to this area of the VGE by scrolling my mouse wheel and then holding down to pan. Where it says IP reference, I'm going to click on the pull down and you can see we've got our constraints that we've created. So we can snap to these. So upper will be the 2%, which is the light blue, and lower will be the 5% or minus 5% in dark blue. So I'm going to pick the upper. Using the same tool I used before, it doesn't matter which one we use, but I'm just going to pick the top of the two and then left click. As soon as I left click, the software will not only snap to the constraint, but also to the nearest available sample line. So it's always snapping onto the upper. If I go back to the IP reference and choose lower, this time it will be snapping to the lower of the two constraints. So we're getting IPs created exactly where we want them. So we now know that the left edge of bitumen at this particular location will be exactly minus 2%. However, at this location, it will be exactly minus 5%. Now, if you find that you've got IPs that you've created are on the wrong constraint, or you need to move them onto an alternative surface, let's just have a look at what would happen if we wanted to change these. So these are currently sitting at minus 2%, and we want them to be sitting at minus 5. Now, we could go about deleting them and then recreating them, but what we could do is, first of all, press escape, because we've currently got a command running down the bottom, so we're going to press escape a couple of times. Then we're going to simply left click on the IP that we want to edit. So I'm going to left click on this IP and then use the match to reference button. So initially we've looked at this as a matching to a surface. It's always using whatever reference we've got chosen. So at the moment the reference we're using is the minus 5. So I'm going to left click on this button to move it. You can see that that IP has been moved. Could do the same with the one to the left. Left click and move on to the chosen reference. You can see that it's also been moved. We're going to click on close to close down the contextual ribbon. If I wanted to edit a group of IPs that have already been created, so rather than left-clicking on each of these IPs that are created and actually having to manually move them, I can use the Edit by Range button instead. So this will achieve what I'm after. So I'm going to say between chainage 0 and we'll say chainage 50, because it's somewhere in the middle here. I'd like to simply just move to the reference that I've currently got selected by using this button. You can see there that those 2 points have been moved. Let's click on Close. So to create IPs on a reference, we can use these 2 buttons. The reference we choose is from the pull-down list, and we can go ahead and choose any of the references that we want. Now we're going to look at a process which will allow us to automate the snapping of IPs directly onto a constraint or a surface.